The hangar bay shook before the alarms even triggered. Sergeant Davin Core felt it through his boots, a deep, bone-rattling shudder that traveled up through the deck plating and into his spine. 30 years of military service had taught him the difference between a controlled detonation and something going catastrophically wrong. This was the latter. He was already moving before the lights shifted to emergency red. The Sovereign Reach was the pride of the Velthari Imperium, a dreadnought so massive that its shadow could swallow a small moon. Core had been assigned to it 6 months ago as part of the Interspecies Diplomatic Exchange, a program designed to embed human military personnel within allied alien fleets. On paper, it was an honor. In practice, it meant spending every waking hour being evaluated, measured, and quietly dismissed. The Velthari were tall, copper-skinned, and built like they'd been carved from something that didn't yield. Their musculature operated on a different biological architecture than humans, layered like cable wire, fed by a circulatory system that ran twice the pressure of human blood. They could lift what humans couldn't. They could endure what humans couldn't. They had made peace with this fact and moved on, as superior beings often did. They had not made peace with having a human aboard. Core had learned this the hard way during his second week, when he'd struggled to carry a resonance coupling during a drill. The Velthara technicians hadn't laughed. Laughing required caring. They'd simply looked at him with something quieter and, worse, assessment. He had been found insufficient and filed away under that verdict. The worst had come from her. Queen Sovereign Vel Asherin, commander of the Sovereign Reach, ruler of 3 star systems, and the most terrifying individual Core had ever stood within 20 feet of, had watched him during that drill with eyes the color of cold nebulae. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't needed to. Her silence had been a verdict delivered without appeal. Later, he'd overheard her speaking to her first counsel in the corridor outside the briefing chamber. She hadn't bothered lowering her voice. Why would she? She hadn't expected the fragile human to understand Velthari. He did. He'd spent 4 months learning it before the assignment. He carries himself like a soldier, she'd said. But he is made of breakable things. Now the breakable thing was sprinting through a collapsing hangar bay toward a sound that no being with functioning survival instincts would run toward. The Starship's primary engine housing had fractured. Not the engines themselves, not yet, but the titanium composite casing that held the portside gravitational motivator array in place had sheared along a stress fracture that maintenance had flagged 3 weeks ago and been overruled on due to diplomatic scheduling. The fracture had finally failed during a microjump sequence. The result was a housing unit weighing approximately 40 metric tons shifting off its magnetic cradle and beginning a slow, catastrophic slide toward the deck. Toward the Queen. She had been conducting an inspection of the propulsion bay, something she did personally and, without warning, as a matter of policy. 2 of her royal guard had been thrown back by the initial shockwave, their armored bodies slamming into the bulkhead with enough force to crack the wall panels. A third had died instantly when a secondary conduit ruptured directly above him. Vel Asherin stood in the center of it, blood on her left shoulder from a fragment strike, staring at the approaching mass of metal with the expression of someone calculating odds and finding them wanting. She had not run because there was nowhere to run. The slide had blocked the primary exit. The secondary was buried under debris. The housing was moving slowly, 3 centimeters per second, maybe 4, but it was moving in only one direction. Core came through the emergency access hatch at the far end of the bay, a maintenance route he'd memorized 2 months ago out of habit. He saw the situation in less than a second. He saw her. He saw the housing. He saw the support pillar midway between them, a secondary magnetic stabilizer strut, still partially engaged, the kind used to help position engine components during installation. If he could get it braced against the housing at the right angle, it might slow the slide. It might buy enough time for her to move. Might. He ran. The deck was shaking. A second conduit blew somewhere above him, and a cascade of hot plasma vented from an emergency release valve, flooding the left side of the bay with heat that was not quite lethal and not quite tolerable. He dropped beneath it, rolled, came up running again. He reached the stabilizer strut. It weighed 600 kilograms. He knew that because he'd read the technical manifest. He'd read every technical manifest. He'd done it because he was the smallest being on the ship in every way they'd chosen to measure, and he'd made a decision, early and quiet and private, that information would be the thing he used instead. He grabbed the strut with both hands, planted his feet, and pulled. Nothing moved. The housing kept sliding. Vel Asherin watched him. Her expression hadn't changed. It was the expression of someone who had already completed the math. He pulled again. Still nothing. He heard something in his left shoulder. Not a crack, not yet, but a warning. He ignored it. He changed his grip, repositioned his feet wider, drove his hips lower, and stopped thinking about the weight and started thinking only about the angle, the leverage, the physics he'd studied not because he was ordered to but because he had always believed that understanding a thing was the first step to refusing to be beaten by it. He lifted. The strut moved. 3 centimeters. Then 6. Then it was off the ground, shaking in his grip, the weight distributed across his entire body in a way that made his vision blur at the edges. He didn't stop. He staggered forward, 1 step, then another, angling the strut toward the housing, toward the precise point where the load would transfer, where metal against metal would slow what physics was determined to complete. He drove it home. The sound was enormous, a ringing, grinding shriek of contact that echoed off every surface in the bay. The housing shuddered. Slowed. Did not stop. But it slowed. "Move," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended because there was not much air left to spare. Vel Asherin looked at him for a fraction of a second that felt like a full minute. Then she moved. She crossed the bay in 6 strides. Velthari could cover ground in a way that made watching them feel like watching something that had never agreed to be bound by ordinary physics. She reached the secondary exit, struck the release mechanism with the flat of her palm, and the door gave. Beyond it was the corridor. Safety. She stopped at the threshold. Core was still holding the strut. The housing was still pressing against it. The stabilizer's engagement coils had partially reinitialized when he'd maneuvered it into place. He'd felt the faint magnetic resistance kick in, adding perhaps 15% structural support to what his body was providing. Combined, it was enough to hold. Barely. Not for long. The metal was singing, a high, thin sound that materials made when they were being asked to hold more than they were designed to hold. Core recognized it. He'd heard it once before, in a collapsed mine on a colony world, where he'd spent 4 hours helping to brace a support structure with 2 other soldiers while civilian rescue teams worked on the other side. They'd held until the evacuation was complete. One of the other soldiers had lost feeling in both hands for 3 weeks afterward. Core had walked away clean that day. He didn't think he was going to walk away clean today. "Sergeant." Her voice was lower than he expected. Not a command. Something else. Something that didn't quite have a name in either of their languages. "The exit is clear," he said, without looking at her. Looking away from the housing felt like a bad idea. "My job is to ensure your safety. Your job is to be safe. These are complementary goals." A pause. "You will die," she said. Not as a question. As a statement of observed fact. "Eventually," he agreed. "Probably not in the next 4 minutes, which is the window I'm working with." The housing groaned. Something deep inside the fractured casing shifted, and, for a moment, the pressure against the strut doubled. His knees bent. He straightened them through something that had moved past effort and into the territory of pure refusal. "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he was avoiding the question, but because the honest answer required a breath he needed for something else. He took it. He used it. "Because you're worth more to 3 star systems than I am," he said. "That's not sentiment. That's logistics." She said nothing. "Also," he added, and he couldn't fully explain why he said it except that it was true, and it seemed important to say something true before things became potentially non-survivable. "You were wrong. About the fragile thing." Another groan from the housing. Another shift. The engagement coils on the strut whined and, then, steadied. He heard her step back through the doorway. He heard the sound stop. Then, he heard something else, a second set of footsteps, heavier, armored. 2 of them. 2 of her royal guard, the ones who'd been thrown by the shockwave. They had recovered. They had come back. They crossed the bay in 4 seconds and braced the strut from the sides with their full Velthara strength, 300 kilograms of muscle and trained force on each arm, pushing where he had been pulling, redistributing the load across 3 bodies instead of 1. The housing slowed to a full stop. The stabilizer coils fully re-engaged with a sound like a deep, resonant bell. The housing locked. Core let go of the strut. His hands were shaking. He noticed this the way he noticed most things about his body in these moments, clinically, with mild interest, and without particular concern. He straightened. He turned around. Vel Asherin was standing in the doorway. She had not left. She had stayed, watching, through the entire thing, until her guard arrived, until the housing was locked, until the danger had passed. She had stayed. Her expression was different now. He didn't have a word for it in Velthari. He wasn't sure there was one. "The maintenance report," she said quietly, "will be reviewed." "Yes, Sovereign," he said. "And you will report to the medical bay." "After I complete my shift documentation, Sovereign." A pause. Long enough to mean something. "Before," she said. He nodded. "Before." She held his gaze for a moment longer than protocol required. Then, she turned and walked down the corridor, her guard falling into position around her, all of them, including the two who had braced the strut, now moving with the quiet precision of beings who had just witnessed something they were going to be thinking about for a long time. Kor looked at the lock housing. He looked at his hands, still trembling faintly. He decided the medical bay documentation could wait 30 seconds while he stood in the empty, red-lit bay and let himself feel the particular, private satisfaction of a man who had just proven a point he'd never actually needed to prove. He breathed. He picked up his equipment. He walked. Word reached the rest of the ship the way things always did aboard a vessel with 12,000 crew members, through the channels that didn't exist officially, through the technicians who'd accessed the bay's monitoring feeds, through the medics who'd treated the surviving guard and heard the account firsthand. By the time Kor reached the medical bay, people were looking at him differently. Not all of them. The Velthari were too disciplined for sudden and obvious reversals. But the quality of the silence had changed. He'd been invisible in a dismissive way before, the kind of invisible that meant not worth noticing. Now the silence had a tension in it. He noticed. He filed it away. He kept walking. The medic who examined his shoulder, a senior physician named Tal Veris, who had spoken exactly 12 words to him across 6 months, ran diagnostics without comment, confirmed minor ligament strain and microtears in 2 stabilizing muscles, applied a regenerative compound, and said, "You should not have been able to do that." "I had good leverage," Kor said. Tal Veris looked at him with the nebula-colored eyes that all Velthari shared, blinked once in the slow, deliberate way that meant "I am choosing not to argue with you," and discharged him with a 3-day recovery recommendation that they both understood he was not going to fully follow. He was halfway back to his quarters when a message came through on his personal comm text only. No sender identification, though it wasn't exactly a mystery. The maintenance division supervisor will be reassigned. The inspection protocol will be revised. These are separate matters from this afternoon. They are, however, related to it. He read it twice. He typed back a single word. Understood. The reply came immediately. "You speak Velthari." He hesitated, then, "For 4 months before the assignment." The pause before her next message was longer. Why? He thought about the mine on the colony world. He thought about the 12-word medic. He thought about the resonance coupling drill and the silence that had been a verdict. He thought about how he'd stood in borrowed space for 6 months and decided each morning that being underestimated was useful only if you were willing to eventually stop being underestimated. He typed, "Because understanding a thing is the first step to refusing to be beaten by it." No reply came. He didn't expect one. He reached his quarters, sat on the edge of his bunk, and looked at his hands. The trembling had stopped. The shoulder ached in a focused, manageable way. He would sleep, and in the morning he would file his incident report with exact and specific language, and he would recommend the maintenance division review as though it were a simple procedural matter, because it was, even if it had almost killed the Queen of 3 star systems in a way that would have reshaped the political architecture of the quadrant. He lay back. He stared at the ceiling of his cabin, standard Velthari design, high and slightly curved, scaled for beings considerably taller than he was. He thought about the word she'd used 6 months ago in that corridor. Fragile. He thought about the strut, the weight, the angle, the physics. He thought about the way she'd stayed in the doorway. He closed his eyes. He slept. In the morning, the briefing room was the same as it always was, silver-walled, high-ceilinged, attended by senior staff in the precise arrangement that Velthari ceremony demanded. Kor took his position at the outer edge, where the human liaison always stood, close enough to observe and far enough to signal that observation was the primary function. Vel Asherin entered last, as she always did. She reviewed the overnight reports in silence, as she always did. She reached the incident summary. The room was very quiet. The structural integrity review of all engine housing cradles will begin today, she said. Priority classification. Critical. All inspections suspended until complete. Sovereign, the engineering chief began. The diplomatic summit timeline has been revised, she said. Simply. Finally. The engineering chief closed his mouth. She moved through the remaining reports at the same pace she always did. At the end, when the briefing was technically concluded and the staff was beginning the subtle repositioning that preceded dispersal, she said, without looking up from the data surface, Sergeant Core. He straightened. Sovereign. Your incident report was thorough. Thank you, Sovereign. It did not include your full assessment of the structural failure. He paused. I wanted to avoid any appearance of overstepping the liaison role. She looked up then. Those cold nebula eyes, direct and complete. Overstepping, she said, is a concern for beings who are where they do not belong. A pause that the entire room felt. Your assessment. Now. He gave it. All of it. The stress fracture report, the overruling, the specific failure points, the cascade risk if secondary housing units were similarly compromised, the estimated timeline before another incident given current operational tempo. He spoke for 4 minutes without notes because he had read every technical manifest and he had a good memory and he had spent 6 months making himself useful in every way except the ones they'd been willing to see. When he finished, the room was quiet in a new way. The engineering chief will work with Sergeant Core on the inspection protocol, Vel Asherin said. Not a suggestion. The engineering chief, a veteran of 40 years of Velthari service, decorated, proud, and, larger than Core by about a factor of 2, looked at the sergeant. Looked at the Queen. Looked back. Yes, Sovereign, he said. She dismissed the briefing. As the room cleared, she remained at the data surface. Core moved toward the exit with everyone else. He was nearly at the door when she spoke again, quietly, to the space between them rather than to him directly. The strut you lifted, she said. The technical manifest lists it at 600 kilograms. Yes, Sovereign. The biomechanical limit for a human of your size and condition is documented at approximately 150. Documents are useful, he said carefully. A pause. They are, she said. They are also incomplete. He turned slightly. She was still looking at the data surface, but she wasn't reading it anymore. I was made of breakable things, he said. Everything is breakable, given the right force. The question is what you do before you break. She was quiet for a long time. The exchange program, she said finally, has a 6-month renewal option. I'm aware. I will be approving it. He stood in the doorway of the briefing room on the most powerful warship in Velthara space, with a shoulder that ached from carrying something no one had expected him to carry, looking at a queen who had watched him refuse to fail and had chosen, carefully and precisely, to update her assessment. Thank you, Sovereign, he said. She nodded once. The movement was small. It meant a great deal. He walked out into the corridor of the Sovereign Reach, past crew members who made room for him now in a way they hadn't before, not with deference, exactly, but with the specific respect that beings gave to something they had misjudged and were quietly in the process of correcting. He walked without hurry. His shoulder ached. His hands were steady. Somewhere behind a closed briefing room door, a queen was standing alone with a data surface and a revised understanding of what fragile meant, and what it didn't, and the particular, irreversible way that one human sergeant had spent 6 months being made of breakable things and refused, quietly and completely, to break. The Sovereign Reach moved through space. It held together. So did he. 33.